stop scrolling, because chaos just discovered a secret that should not exist. And I'm not talking about the Imperium. I'm not talking about the Necrons. I'm talking about something that has been hiding beneath the warp itself for 10,000 years. Yeah, let that sink in. Because everybody in Warhammer thinks they understand the warp. The Chaos Gods think they own it. The Imperium thinks it's hell.
Your world crumbles before me!
But what if both sides were wrong? What if every war, every betrayal, every nightmare in the galaxy has been feeding something nobody knew was there? And here's the part that should terrify you. It didn't invade. It didn't arrive. It was already here. If the Chaos Gods were never have the oldest things in the warp, what exactly has been waiting underneath them this whole time? Check this out, because this story gets absolutely insane.
The Bloodthirster had no name for what it felt. It had names for everything else. 10,000 years of existence had given it a vocabulary for every sensation that mattered. The hot copper taste of a skull taken cleanly, the specific pressure of a worthy opponent's final swing landing against its hide, the satisfaction of watching a city burn from altitude, the way bloodlust felt different from hunger, but equally necessary. It had cataloged these things across 10 millennia of service to Khorne, and had found the catalog sufficient. The thing it felt in the deep warp had no entry in the catalog. It had been moving through the dark places, the spaces between the great emotional storms that the Chaos Gods generated, the relatively calm waters of the Imperium that existed in the gaps between Khornate rage currents and Tzeentchian plot eddies. These spaces were not empty. Nothing in the warp was empty, but they were quieter than the main channels, and quieter meant useful for travel when you did not want your passage observed. The Bloodthirster had been taking this route for centuries. Something was different. Not a sound. The warp did not produce sound in any way that biological ears would process. Not a sight. The warp's visual phenomena were expressions of emotional energy rather than reflected light. Something more fundamental than either. Something that the Bloodthirster's demonic senses, tuned across 10,000 years to read the Imperium the way a sailor read weather, were returning as a category error. There was a presence in the dark. Not Tzeentchian, not Nurgish, not the sharp perfume of Slaaneish's influence, or the territorial press of another Khornate entity. The Bloodthirster knew those signatures the way it knew its own acts, by weight and texture, and the specific way they pushed back when you pushed against them. This pushed back differently. It pushed back the way deep water pushed back when something large moved beneath the surface. Displacement without visibility, presence without declaration. The Bloodthirster stopped. It had never stopped in the warp before. Stopping implied hesitation, and hesitation was antithetical to every principle that 10,000 years of Khornate existence had ground into it. You moved, you struck, you took skulls. The idea of stopping to consider was Tzeentchian cowardice, the kind of behavior that Khorne punished. It stopped. It looked at the dark. The dark looked back, not with eyes, with the specific quality of, no, not that, with attention, ancient, patient attention. The kind that had been looking at this particular stretch of deep warp for longer than the Bloodthirster had existed, cataloging it, waiting in it, consuming what it produced in perfect silence. The Bloodthirster had faced greater daemons of other gods, had faced Primarchs, had faced the weapons of the Adeptus Astartes' most elite warriors, and had laughed at the weapons while it dismembered their wielders. In 10,000 years it had laughed at a great many things. It did not laugh now. What it felt, and it would never report this to Khorne, would bury the memory so deep that the blood god's psychic reach would find only the surface, was the faintest edge of something it did not have a word for, because it had never needed one. It turned. It moved back through the deep warp the way it had come, faster than it had arrived, with the purposeful urgency of a being that had decided this errand could wait. A Bloodthirster of Khorne retreated. In the dark, where no one was watching, The something that had been watching continued to watch. It did not pursue. It did not react. It simply noted the retreat, with the patience of something that had been waiting 10,000 years, and found the bloodthirster's response entirely predictable. 6 seconds later, in Tzeentch's domain in the warp, both of Kairos Fateweaver's mouths closed at the same time. This had never happened. The Oracle of Tzeentch existed in permanent contradiction, one head speaking what was, one head speaking what would be, the two streams of knowledge always running simultaneously, always diverging, always producing the beautiful, irresolvable paradox that was Tzeentch's greatest servant's defining feature. The two mouths were never silent together. The two mouths were never in agreement. The moment when both mouths fell silent simultaneously was, in the specific architecture of the Crystal Labyrinth, louder than anything that had ever happened there. Tzeentch felt it. The sensation. If something that was an emotional hurricane given consciousness could be said to feel sensations, was something he had not experienced in 10,000 years of scheming across the length of a galaxy. Incomplete information. He had not had incomplete information in 10,000 years. He had imperfect information. Yes, information he was choosing not to integrate yet, because the scheme required withholding. Information he was holding for the right moment. Information that would become more valuable later. That was different. That was control. This was not that. This was a gap in his knowledge that he had not created. He looked at Fateweaver, both heads closed, both mouths sealed. Both pairs of eyes pointing in the same direction for the first time in the Oracle's existence. What do you see? Tzeentch said. Both mouths opened. Both said the same thing. They were here before us. Inquisitor Covenant arrived at the Underhive of Vithara 4 at 0340 hours by the planet's internal clock, which she had synchronized with ship time when she landed, because synchronization was the kind of thing she did automatically, and had always done automatically. The organizational habit of a mind that processed the galaxy through a system of precise categories that she maintained, like a surgeon maintained instruments. The Arbites had secured a perimeter, 17 cultists in custody, which was not unusual. The ritual site beneath a disused manufactorum in sublevel 9, which was not unusual. The summary report flagging it as standard chaos cult activity, which was the assessment she expected. She walked through the perimeter. She looked at the ritual site. She stood there for 9 seconds, which was 8 seconds longer than she normally required to classify a cult site. The iconography was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of unusual chaos symbolism. She had cataloged 3,000 variants of chaos iconography across 20 years of Ordo Malleus work, from the obvious four-pointed stars of generic chaos worship to the deeply obscure personal sigils of daemon princes whose names appeared in only 3 documents in the Inquisitorial archive. She knew wrong chaos iconography. This was not chaos iconography. It was not the negation of chaos iconography either, not an inquisitorial symbol or an imperial aquila, or anything affiliated with the Imperium's institutions. It was not Xenos, which she also had reference material for. It was not any recognized hermetic or occult tradition that predated the Imperium's founding. It was something she had never seen. She photographed it from 4 angles. She transmitted the photographs to her acolytes database with a standard cross-reference request. She looked at the 17 cultists while the search ran. They were wrong too, but differently wrong than the symbol. Cultists, in her experience, were wrong in specific ways, depending on which power had touched them. The feverish energy of cornate corruption, the unsettling perceptiveness of Tzeentch's influence, the bloated contentment of Nurgle's blessing, the restless dissatisfaction that preceded Slaneshi devotion. These 17 had none of those textures. They had one texture that they all shared. They were afraid. Not of her, not of the Arbites surrounding them, not of the ritual site or its consequences, or the inquisitorial authority that was about to come down on them like a hammer. Afraid of something that wasn't in this room. Afraid of something they had seen somewhere else and could not stop seeing. the eyes of people who had been shown something and had not recovered from the showing. Her Vox chimed. The cross-reference result: no match found. 20 years. 3,000 cataloged variants. Access to the most comprehensive occult iconographic database the Ordo Malleus maintained. No match. She walked to the nearest cultist. Male, late 30s, the work-calloused hands of underhive labor and the hollow eyes of someone who had not slept in days. "What did you see?" she said. He looked at her, through her, slightly, the focus of someone whose attention was on something that was not in the physical room. "It was already there," he said. The voice was calm, not the calm of acceptance, the calm of someone who had moved beyond the register, where calm and not calm were meaningful distinctions. "We didn't call it. We found it. We went deep enough in the underhive and it was already there. Already. It has always been there. It was there before the hive was built, before the planet was settled." He looked at the symbol on the floor. "It told us what it was." "Tell me," Covenant said. He opened his mouth. The word that came out was Diablo. Then his eyes went dark, not closed, open and dark, emptied of the specific biological light that eyes had when they were occupied, and he fell. 16 other cultists fell in the same moment, not a sound between any of them, not a convulsion. Occupied, then unoccupied, then on the floor. Covenant stood in the sudden silence of 17 bodies and a symbol that did not exist in any record, her hand halfway to her Vox, the word still in the air. She did not feel afraid. She had learned not to feel afraid in emergency situations by replacing the fear with function. She activated her Vox. "This is Inquisitor Covenant, Ordo Malleus, Vithara 4. The same voice she used for routine reports. I need Grey Knight's contact. Priority Alpha. A beat. Pull every record of anomalous warp activity from the Segmentum Tempestus. Not the last decade. Everything. Every document going back to the heresy." She looked at the symbol. "And find me any instance in the Inquisitorial Archive where the word Diablo appears in connection with a warp entity that is not a recognized chaos power or daemon." The silence on the channel told her the request had been received. She looked at the 17 bodies, at the specific way they had all gone simultaneously, as if something had simply stopped maintaining them when it no longer needed them present. She had processed thousands of cultist deaths in 20 years. They died violently, or they died in custody awaiting sentence, or they died by their own hands in the specific finale of possession when the demonic occupant decided it was done with its host. They did not die like this. They did not go out like candles. Whatever had been using them had finished using them. Whatever had been here had moved on. She knelt beside the nearest body. She looked at the expression on his face. People who died in terror died with terror's evidence on them. People who died in ecstasy, or in Nurgle's embrace, or in the blood-drunk final moments of cornate possession. All of them left evidence of how they went. She had learned to read those evidences the way a pathologist read tissue. This man's face was blank, not peaceful, not traumatized, blank. As if every expression that had ever lived there had been quietly borrowed and then returned, and the returning had left nothing. She stood. She looked at the symbol on the floor for a long moment. Then she looked at the ceiling, above which 12 levels of underhive extended down to the planet's foundation bedrock, and below which, if the cultist had been telling the truth about what they found and where they found it, something had been in residence long before any human being arrived on this world. She walked out of the ritual site. She had a great deal of work to do. The archive request took 11 hours to process, not because the search was computationally difficult, because the Inquisitorial Archive across the Segmentum Tempestus encompassed 10,000 years of documentation, and the word she had asked them to search for appeared in the archive exactly 3 times. 3 times, across 10,000 years, in an archive that contained more words than some worlds had people. The first appearance was in a fragment of a trader's journal from M35, describing a nightmare the traitor had experienced repeatedly during a warp transit. The nightmare featured a horned figure surrounded by flame who told the traitor his name. The journal entry was filed in the archive's anomalous personal testimony section, cross-referenced under psychological warp effects, classified as low-priority psychic contamination from transit stress. Nobody had looked at it again in 2,000 years. The second appearance was in an Ordo Xenos field report from M38, documenting recovered fragments of an alien text found on a dead world in the outer reaches of the segmentum. The translator servitor had produced a partial rendering that included the word in a context the Inquisitor had flagged as unclear. The report concluded that the dead world's former inhabitants had worshipped a being called by that name, probably a primitive deity construct, and that the inhabitants had been dead for so long that no further investigation was warranted. The world was listed as dead and filed. The third appearance was 11 years ago. An Ordo Malleus interrogation transcript from a captured Chaos Space Marine, Iron Warriors, taken during a raid gone wrong near the segmentum's inner border. The Iron Warrior had been ranting during interrogation, the kind of pressured, incoherent speech that captured Chaos Marines sometimes produced, and the interrogating Inquisitor had flagged most of it as psychological deterioration and extraction fatigue psychosis. One line was underlined in the transcript. The Inquisitor who conducted the interrogation had underlined it and had written nothing beside it. Just the line, underlined, sitting in the middle of pages of flagged as incoherent material. The line read, "Something in the deep warp has been there longer than corn. I felt it once, when I was far enough in. I have not gone back that far since." Covenant read the 3 entries. She read them again. She pulled the name of the Inquisitor who conducted the interrogation 11 years ago, Inquisitor Varro, deceased. 2 years after the interrogation, listed as lost in action during a daemon incursion on a frontier world. Ordo Malleus confirmed kill. She looked at the date of his death. She looked at the date of the interrogation. She thought about an Inquisitor who had found one line worth underlining in a Chaos Marine's ranting, had filed the transcript, and had been dead 2 years later. She transmitted the 3 documents to the Grey Knight's contact she had requested. Then she sat at her desk for 3 minutes without moving, which was something she had not done in longer than she could remember, because she had learned early in her career that the moments when you needed to sit still were the moments when you most needed to not sit still. She sat still. She looked at the symbol she had photographed. She looked at 3 mentions of one name across 10,000 years of the most comprehensive occult archive in the galaxy. 3 mentions. Something had been in the warp since before the Horus Heresy. It had appeared in the record 3 times. 3. She picked up her Vox again. Covenant to Grey Knight's contact. I need Grandmaster Vane's direct channel, not his staff, him. She looked at the symbol. And I need the warp activity pattern analysis to start tonight. Not when it's convenient. Tonight. She looked at the 3 documents. At the Iron Warrior's line, underlined by a man who was now dead. Something in the deep warp has been there longer than corn. She closed the documents. She stood. She had 11 hours of archive results to review, and a Grey Knight Grand Master to brief, and a warp activity pattern analysis to commission, and 17 dead bodies in a sub-level manufactorum whose killer had left no psychic trace and no forensic evidence, and 1 symbol that did not exist in any record. She had enough to start with. She went to work. Grand Master Aldrich Vane had 40 years of Grey Knight service behind him, and a specific relationship with impossible situations that those 40 years had built. He did not wait for them to become possible before he moved into them. He read Covenant's transmission on approach to Vithara 4, and by the time his strike cruiser broke atmosphere, he had reviewed the 3 archive entries, the warp activity request, the symbol photograph, and the interrogation transcript with the underlined line. He had not reviewed them in the order they were sent. He had reviewed them in the order that told the clearest story, which was the Iron Warrior first, the Trader's Journal second, the Dead World's alien text third, the symbol last. The order mattered, because the Iron Warrior had been in the deep warp and had come back with something specific and true, and truth from an unexpected source was still truth, and Vane had spent 40 years learning to find the truth in places the Inquisitorial Archive had filed under low priority. He landed. He met Covenant in the sublevel. She had not slept. He could see it in the way she held herself, not deteriorating, controlled, the particular stillness of someone running on professional obligation rather than physical rest. He looked at the symbol on the floor. He felt the residue. Every Grey Knight was a psyker, trained and sanctified and armored against the warp's worst expressions. That training gave him senses that extended beyond what his physical body could perceive. He felt the warp's texture the way a blind man felt a room, through what pushed back and what didn't. He had walked into thousands of ritual sites and felt the psychic residue of what had happened there. This one felt wrong in a direction he didn't have language for. Daemon sites felt like pressure, like something vast leaning against a door, the specific emotional weight of whichever power had been invoked. Cornate sites carried fury like heat. Sintian sites carried the uneasy feeling of being observed from an angle you couldn't locate. Nurgish sites had the dense, almost comfortable weight of something that had decided decay was love. This felt like none of those. It felt like the absence of those. Not empty. Something had been here. Definitely. Something with genuine presence and power. But the residue was wrong. It sat at a level below the emotional register that chaos energy occupied. Deeper. Older. The way a geological stratum was older than the soil above it, not because it was more powerful, but because it had been laid down before the soil existed. You feel it, Covenant said. Not a question. Wrong direction, he said. He kept his eyes on the symbol. Chaos residue sits above you in the warp. This sits below. Below. Like something that was here before the chaos signatures existed, before the powers occupied this space. He looked at the symbol. The powers are surface phenomena. Whatever left this residue is subsurface. Covenant looked at him. The Iron Warrior said something in the deep warp has been there longer than Khorne. I know. He had read the transcript 4 times on approach. I want to find the active trace. The ritual happened here, but whatever conducted it has moved. There will be a trail in the local warp space. Can you follow it? He looked at her. I'm going to find out, he said. The warp activity analysis came back 18 hours later. Not from Covenant's team, they were still processing. It came back from a servitor analyst working the deep archive in the Segmentum's administrative capital, a being that had been running pattern analysis on historical warp data for so long that pattern recognition had become its primary cognitive function rather than a tool it used. It had found a pattern. Covenant read the results standing at her field desk with a cup of recaf going cold beside her, and the symbol photograph pinned to the wall, and the 3 archive entries arranged in chronological order where she could see them while she read. The pattern the servitor had found was not in the event data. Event data, demonic incursions, warp storms, psyker activity spikes, reality tears, was too noisy. 10,000 years of chaos activity in the Segmentum Tempestus produced event data that looked like static at scale, each individual event significant, and each event drowning out every other event. The servitor had not analyzed the events. It had analyzed the background. The emotional composition of the warp changed over time in ways that standard monitoring tracked, but nobody examined at scale, because examining 10,000 years of background warp composition data required either a very patient servitor or a very specific reason to look. The servitor was patient. Covenant had given it a reason. The background data showed something that the event data would never have revealed. Fear energy and hatred energy in specific regions of the Segmentum had been behaving differently than chaos models predicted. Not dramatically differently. The deviation from expected behavior was within normal statistical variance for any given year, any given century, even any given millennium. The deviation only became visible when you put all 10,000 years of data together and looked for a cumulative direction. The cumulative direction was this. In 8 distinct regions of the Segmentum, spread across the full 10,000 years. Fear energy and hatred energy had been migrating, moving from the chaos-aligned substrate, the specific emotional frequencies that fed the chaos powers, into an unattributed reservoir, not disappearing, not being destroyed, moving. Something had been redirecting the warp's emotional output. Not all of it, a fraction of it, small enough that no individual period's data flagged it as anomalous. But 10,000 years of a small fraction, compounded, produced a reservoir of fear energy and hatred energy that existed outside the Chaos God's emotional economy. Covenant looked at the numbers. She looked at the numbers for a long time. The reservoir was not small anymore. 10,000 years of small fractions, compounded, was an enormous amount of power. Power that the Chaos Gods had produced through 10 millennia of corrupting humanity and had never received, because something between them and their followers had been quietly taking a cut. She picked up her Vox. "Get me Vayne," she said. Vayne's team had found the trail. It led down, not geographically down. Warp space did not have fixed geography the way real space did. Down, in the sense of depth, toward the subsurface warp that existed beneath the emotional storms and the Chaos God domains. The deep immaterium that was quieter than the upper warp and less traveled, and, it was becoming apparent, less empty than anyone had assumed. 3 Grey Knights followed the trail, with Vayne leading, Nemesis Force swords drawn, because the trail warranted it. Moving through the psychic space of the deep warp with the trained precision of warriors who had learned to navigate the immaterium without losing themselves in it. The trail was not subtle once you knew what to look for. Something had moved through this space recently. Recently in warp time, which was unreliable but gave approximate texture. The trail was not the emotional blaze that chaos entities left. It was the inverse, a place where the warp's background emotional composition had been locally depleted, as if something had passed through and absorbed the ambient fear energy and hatred energy as it moved, the way a wick absorbed wax. They followed it for what felt like 2 hours in warp time, and might have been minutes or days in real space. The trail ended in a space that Vayne had no cartographic reference for. The deep warp here was different from the warp he had operated in for 40 years. Less chaotic, not calmer, less chaotic, which was a meaningful distinction. The Chaos God's emotional storms did not penetrate here. The specific turbulence that made upper warp navigation hazardous was absent. This space was dark and still and very old, and the oldness was the kind that had a weight to it, the geological weight of something that had been accumulating without disturbance for a very long time. There was something in the space. Not a being, not a presence the way the Bloodthirster had encountered presence. More like a structure, the warp equivalent of a structure, a pattern of organized intentionality that had been built carefully over time and had achieved a stability that the surrounding warp did not have. Vayne reached toward it with his psychic senses. The structure reached back. He felt, in the reaching, the specific texture of something that had been waiting for exactly this, not for him specifically, but for something like him, a Grey Knight's probe. An inquisitorial investigation, the attention of the Imperium's dedicated demonic intelligence apparatus. The structure had been waiting for exactly this kind of attention, and when it arrived, it opened. Not widely, a fraction. Just enough to show him one thing. What Vayne saw was not a vision in the standard sense. It was not symbolic or prophetic, or the kind of warp experience that required interpretation. It was direct, a piece of information delivered without ceremony. He saw the warp's deep history, laid out in a shape he could comprehend. The Chaos Gods, vast and turbulent, occupying the upper warp like weather systems, feeding on the galaxy's emotional output, growing and warring and growing, and beneath them, invisible in the depth, 3 shapes. Not growing, not feeding in the frantic upward way the Chaos Gods fed. Something else, drawing down the specific fear energy and hatred energy that the Chaos Gods produced and discarded, the processed output, the emotional runoff of 10,000 years of chaos activity, and accumulating it with patient precision. Not stealing power, composting it. Taking what the chaos gods wasted and turning it into something denser, more concentrated, more refined. 10,000 years of the galaxy's fear and hatred and destruction run through a process that distilled it into its pure form, rather than leaving it as the diluted chaos-flavored version the powers produced. The three shapes in the dark, patient, ancient, watching him watch them. He pulled back. He pulled back fast, because what he had seen was information, and information was most useful when you were alive to report it. And staying in contact with three entities that had just casually shown him 10,000 years of hidden activity felt like exactly the kind of action that ended Grey Knight careers permanently.
He pulled back. He grabbed the two Grey Knights beside him and pulled back through the trail they had followed in, moving faster than they had come, up through the deep warp and into the upper reaches, and back toward the anchor point his cruiser maintained in real space.
They arrived back, all three of them, which was something Vane had not been certain would happen. He sat in the strike cruiser's command chamber and looked at his hands for a moment. Then he activated the Vox to Covenant. "I found the trail," he said. "I found where it leads. A beat. Three entities, not chaos, older than chaos. They have been in the deep warp for the full 10,000 years, and they have been using the Chaos God's emotional output as a power source, distilling it, accumulating it." He looked at his hands. "They knew I was there. They let me see them, not because they made a mistake." He looked at the wall, "because they wanted me to." Covenant's voice came back, tight with controlled urgency. How powerful. Vane thought about the structure he had felt, the weight of it, the geological patience of 10 millennia of careful accumulation. "Tell me what the warp activity analysis found," he said. "First," she told him. He listened to the numbers, the reservoir, the migration, 10,000 years of small fractions compounding. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "That's their fuel reserve," he said. "What I felt in the deep warp, that's what 10,000 years of that accumulation produces." He looked at the wall. They are not greater daemon level, Covenant. They are not daemon prince level. He thought about how to say the next thing. "I felt the boundary of what they are. They sit at the level beneath the Chaos Gods, not at the Chaos Gods level." Beneath it, in the sense of depth. They have been sitting beneath the Chaos Gods for 10,000 years, and the Chaos Gods have never looked down far enough to notice. The channel was quiet. "The Chaos Gods are going to notice now," Covenant said. "When they sense the entities becoming active." "They already have," Vane said. "That's why they let me see them. They're announcing themselves, not to me, through me." He picked up his Nemesis Force sword from where he had set it on the table. "They knew I would report this. They wanted us to know before we found out another way." He looked at the sword. "Something announces itself when it's ready, not before." He stood. "Get me a channel to the Regent," he said. Not his staff. Guilliman directly. He looked at the sword. "And Covenant. Pull the Ordo Malleus records for every instance where a Grey Knight's Nemesis weapon behaved anomalously against a non-standard warp entity. Anything where the weapon worked, but worked differently than expected. Not failures, anomalies." He thought about the structure reaching back when he probed it. About the specific way it had not been disrupted, the way a chaos entity was disrupted, had simply registered the probe and responded to it. "I need to know if anyone else has touched these things and what happened when they did." He walked out of the command chamber. Behind him, the deep warp rolled on in silence, and three things in its depths watched the strike cruiser's departure with the patience of geological time and found the departure entirely satisfactory. The Ordo Malleus record search took 6 hours. What it returned? Nothing. Not nothing in the sense of no matching records. Nothing in the sense that the search parameters Vane had specified, Grey Knight Nemesis weapon anomalies, non-standard warp entities, returned records that had been wiped. Not the records themselves. The specific data points within the records. Cases that existed in the archive, case numbers, dates, inquisitorial stamps, all the administrative scaffolding of a properly filed report, but whose content fields contained nothing, as if someone had removed the actual content while leaving the structural evidence that content had once existed. 14 cases, spread across 900 years. 14 cases where a Grey Knight had encountered something, filed a report, and the report's content had subsequently been deleted. Covenant looked at the administrative scaffolding of the 14 empty cases. She looked at the case numbers. She pulled the signatory lines, the inquisitors who had originally filed each case, whose rosette stamps appeared on the administrative record, even though the content was gone. 8 of them were dead. Of the remaining 6, 3 had subsequently been seconded to classified Ordo subdivisions, whose current operational status was itself classified. 2 she could not locate in the current registry. 1 was still active. Inquisitor Theo Sable, Ordo Malleus, currently attached to a Grey Knight strike force, operating in the Segmentum Obscurus. She opened a channel. It took 40 minutes to reach him. When he answered, his voice had the careful quality of someone who had been expecting this call for a long time and had been hoping they were wrong about expecting it. "You found the empty records," he said. 900 years of them, Covenant said. "How far back did you look?" 14 cases. "There are more," Sable said. "Further back. I found 23 before I stopped looking. Stopped looking because the pattern was clear, and continuing to find more cases was not going to produce different conclusions." His voice was even. "What do you want to know?" "What's in the cases?" Covenant said. "Encounters," Sable said. "Various Grey Knights, over 900 years, encountering something in the warp that their weapons worked on, but didn't work on correctly. Non-standard responses. The Nemesis blades hurt the entities, but didn't disrupt them the way Chaos native entities were disrupted." A pause. "In each case, the Grey Knight subsequently filed a report. In each case, the report content was removed. In each case, the filing Inquisitor was either dead within 2 years or was transferred to a classification level I cannot access." "Who removed the content?" Covenant said. "I don't know," Sable said. "The deletion records don't have signatory stamps." "They were removed by someone with archive access above standard Inquisitor level." "And you filed your own case," Covenant said. 14 months ago, Sable said. "My content is still there. My case is 14 months old." "I'm watching to see how long it takes." Covenant looked at the 14 empty records. At 900 years of evidence that someone had been trying to keep this specific information from accumulating in the Inquisitorial archive. Not all the information about these entities. The 3 archive entries she had found were still present, not deleted, the Trader's Journal, and the Dead World Report, and the underlined line in the Iron Warrior's transcript. Those were too small, too individually insignificant to bother removing. The Grey Knight's cases were different. Those were armed personnel encountering these entities directly, building an operational picture, developing weapons effectiveness data. Someone did not want that data to accumulate. "Sable," she said, "in your encounter, what did you see?" The pause before he answered was long enough that she thought the channel had dropped. "It showed me something," he said. "Not an attack, an image, a shape in the warp that looked like a map, not of territory, of time. The whole span of the Imperium's existence, all 10,000 years of it, laid out as a shape, and within the shape, certain points were illuminated." His voice stayed even throughout, not at random. The illuminated points were all moments where something went wrong in a specific way, not battles, not demonic incursions, moments where an institution failed, where a bond that was supposed to hold broke. The channel was quiet for a moment. The illuminated points were everywhere in the map. There were a great many of them. Covenant looked at the symbol she had photographed on the floor of the sub-level manufactorum. "What does that tell you?" she said. "That whoever showed me the map," Sable said, "wanted me to understand the scope of what they had been doing, not to stop me." He paused, "to make sure I understood that stopping them wasn't a meaningful concept anymore." The channel hummed. "Outside Covenant's field office, Vithara IV's night side had turned, and the planet's sun was rising, light hitting the hive's upper spires, while the underhives, where 17 dead cultists lay arranged around an unrecognized symbol, remained in the permanent dark that underhives always occupied. She looked at 14 empty record cases, at 900 years of someone erasing the evidence, at a map of 10,000 years of institutional failures, illuminated point by point. She did something she had not done since her first year of service, when the scale of what the Imperium was had first fully landed on her, and she had needed 2 days to integrate it before she could work again. She sat down. She looked at the case records. She thought about what erasing 23 Grey Knight cases across 900 years required. Not just archive access, not just inquisitorial authority, but the specific knowledge that the cases existed, which meant the specific knowledge of every encounter with these entities, which meant someone in the Inquisition's higher tiers had known about these entities for 900 years and had been suppressing the evidence. Not the entities themselves, the evidence of the entities. The entities, apparently, did not need suppressing. She picked up her Vox. "Get me Guilliman," she said. "Priority Alpha, not his staff." She looked at the files. "Tell him it concerns something that has been in the warp for 10,000 years, that his Inquisition has been hiding evidence of for 900 years, and that showed a Grey Knight a map of every institutional failure in Imperial history, and wanted the Grey Knight to know it was complete." She looked at the ceiling. "Tell him it's urgent, in the sense that I believe they chose this moment to be found." Baal moved because he was done being still. 10,000 years. Not metaphorical years. Not the compressed time of the warp, where centuries could fold into moments. 10,000 actual years of measured patience, of holding the specific kinetic energy of his nature in check, while Mephisto studied and Diablo planned. 10,000 years of watching the Chaos Gods feed on a galaxy full of destruction, and feeling the specific insult of it. Lesser beings doing an inferior version of the thing he was made for, and receiving worship for it. He had agreed to wait. He was done waiting. The Iron Warriors warband was in the Korvath system when he found them. A full company, 80 warriors who had been traitor legionnaires since the heresy, and who had spent 10,000 years in the Long War with the pragmatic professionalism of beings who had removed ideology from their practice of violence long ago and simply fought because fighting was the only economy they understood. They were raiding an agri-world, not dramatically, efficiently, the way the Iron Warriors did everything. The planet's defenses had been assessed, the optimal extraction routes planned, the specific targets selected for maximum material yield with minimum unnecessary engagement. They had been doing operations like this for millennia. They were very good at them. Baal did not enter the system with a manifestation. He entered through the quality of the silence in the spaces between things. The first Iron Warrior to notice was the company's siege captain, a warrior named Krovar who had been a legionnaire since before the heresy and who had survived 10 millennia of the Long War through a combination of exceptional tactical intelligence and the specific paranoia of someone who had seen too many of his brothers die, believing themselves secure. Krovar had a sensor for wrongness that had nothing to do with his armor's systems and everything to do with 40,000 years of accumulated combat instinct. He stopped in the middle of issuing a movement order. He looked at the space around him, not at anything specific, at the quality of the space itself. Something about it had changed, not visibly, not in any way his armor's instruments would register. The way a room changed when someone left it, not emptier, differently weighted. He said nothing to his squad. He waited. The feeling grew. It grew in the specific direction of meaning draining out of things. Not his thoughts. His thoughts were fine. His tactical calculations were intact. His memory of the operation's objectives was precise. But the objectives themselves, the meaning behind the objectives, the reason the numbers on the extraction manifest represented things worth having, that was what was draining. Krovar had fought in the Long War for 10,000 years. He had fought through crises of faith, and crises of supply, and crises of political alignment within the Iron Warriors' internal hierarchy, and every other form of crisis that 10 millennia of war could produce. He had never experienced this particular sensation. Not doubt, not despair, not the crisis of a man questioning his cause. Something colder and more absolute than any of those. The simple functional absence of a reason. "Sergeant," he said to the warrior beside him, keeping his voice level, "do you know why we are here?" The sergeant looked at him. "The agri-world, sir." "The extraction." "I know what we're doing," Krovar said. "I asked why." The sergeant opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the extraction manifest in his hand. He looked at Krovar. He stopped. Krovar turned away from him and looked at the system around them, and in the specific pragmatic clarity of a being who had cut everything unnecessary from his experience long ago, he identified what was happening and what it meant and what he should do about it. Something was doing this deliberately, something capable of reaching into the functional core of Iron Warriors' motivation, not their ideology, not their emotion, not the chaos-colored drives that had kept them fighting for 10,000 years, but the deep, pragmatic purposiveness that was what remained when you removed all of those, and drawing the substance out of it. He activated his personal vox to a frequency he had never used. He had held the frequency for 900 years. He had taken it from a dying Inquisitor whose ship had been boarded during a raid that Krovar had authorized. A dying Inquisitor who had told Krovar that there were things in the deep warp that neither Chaos nor the Imperium understood, and that if Krovar ever encountered one, this frequency would reach someone who needed to know. Krovar had kept the frequency because Krovar kept everything that might have value. "This is Iron Warriors Siege Captain Krovar," he said. "I am transmitting on the frequency given to me by Inquisitor Halsey, M38. I have encountered something in my system that is not Chaos and is not Xenos, and does not appear in any reference I possess." He watched his company standing at their positions, all of them with the same quality of arrested motion that Krovar felt, all of them holding the specific frozen posture of beings in the middle of forgetting why they were standing where they were standing. "It is affecting my forces. I am sharing coordinates." He transmitted. He looked at the space around him. "We are going to stay here," he said to the frequency, without any confidence that anyone was listening. "Not because I am not capable of leaving, because leaving implies a destination, and I am currently experiencing some difficulty identifying one." Baal manifested fully in Krovar's command chamber aboard the Iron Warriors flagship, not with fire or sound or the theatrical darkness that Chaos entities used for arrival. He simply became present, the way a temperature change became present, noticed suddenly when you could not identify exactly when it began. He was enormous. The physical form he had built in the warp across 10,000 years carried the weight of entropy given will and preference, not the frantic destructive energy of a cornate daemon, not even the violent immediacy that beings encountering him expected from something called the Lord of Destruction. He was quieter than that, older than that. Destruction was patient when it understood that everything eventually came to it. Krovar looked at him. Krovar was a being who had looked at Primarchs and greater demons and horrors from the eye of terror without rearranging his face. He looked at Baal with the same flat assessment. "What are you?" Krovar said. Baal looked at the Iron Warrior. 10,000 years of combat experience in ceramite plate, the specific posture of a warrior who would fight anything and had. "You have been fighting for 10,000 years, Baal said. His voice was not loud. It filled the room the way that geological sounds filled spaces, not with volume but with depth. "Name one thing the fighting has built." Krovar looked at him. It was not a rhetorical question. Baal waited. He had time. Krovar named things. His chapter's survival, their operational capacity, the continued existence of the Iron Warriors as a military force. He laid each one out with the precision of a man who had maintained his survival through exactly this kind of ruthless inventory. Baal listened to each one. "Those are descriptions of continuing to exist," Baal said, "not things built." Krovar stopped. "Corn gives you slaughter. and takes the skulls, Baal said. The blood god feeds on what your violence produces. What do you receive? Krovar's answer did not come immediately. This was unusual. Krovar had answers for everything. Purpose, he said, when it came. But the word was hollow when he said it. He heard the hollowness. The purpose was supplied to you, Baal said, long ago, by Perturabo, who received it from Chaos, who manufactures purpose the way your world manufactures weapons, functionally, interchangeably, without any particular relationship to the specific being wielding it. He looked at the Iron Warrior. You have been fighting for 10,000 years with a purpose you were given and have never examined. And you're going to tell me examining it will reveal something useful, Krovar said, the pragmatist's suspicion of any argument structured as a revelation. No, Baal said. Examining it will reveal that it is empty, that the purpose was always empty, that you have been emptied of the thing that could generate genuine purpose and have been running on the residue of what was taken from you at the heresy. Krovar looked at him. The silence between them had a texture. You're not offering me anything, Krovar said slowly. You're not saying, I will give you purpose. Follow me. You're just telling me the other thing was empty. Yes, Baal said. Why? Baal looked at him. Because you are pragmatic enough to use the information. Most beings cannot. They hear their purpose is empty, and they manufacture a replacement immediately. A new devotion, a new cause, anything to fill the space. He looked at the Iron Warrior with something that might have been assessment and might have been the closest thing to respect that a being of pure entropy could generate. You will sit with the empty space, and in the empty space you will find what was there before they filled it. Krovar looked at the empty space where his reason for the current operation had been. What do you want from me? He said. Nothing yet, Baal said. I am not recruiting. I am introducing myself. He looked at Krovar for a moment longer. Then he was not there. Krovar stood in his command chamber alone and looked at the space where Baal had been and inventoried what had just happened with the same systematic precision he applied to all tactical situations. He had been shown that his purpose was empty. He had not been given a replacement. He had been told that a being called, and he had felt the name arrive in his awareness without Baal having said it aloud. The Lord of Destruction found him interesting enough to introduce himself to. Krovar was a survivor. 10,000 years of survival had built the specific skill of knowing when an encounter mattered and when it did not, and acting accordingly. This mattered. He activated the frequency again. The thing I described, he said into the Vox. It spoke to me. It told me its name. I am transmitting everything. He transmitted. Then he recalled his company from their positions and ordered a full withdrawal from the system, because the Korvath extraction now had the specific quality of an objective that no longer made sense, and Krovar did not pursue objectives that did not make sense. He would need time to think. He had a feeling he was being given exactly that. On Tzeentch's highest crystalline spire, Kairos Fateweaver's two heads were arguing again. This was normal. The two heads argued because they occupied different temporal positions, and agreement between them was a structural impossibility. What was and what would be could not agree without ceasing to be what was and what would be. The argument was the natural state, but the argument had changed. Before both mouths had closed at the same time, before the thing they had both seen had appeared simultaneously in what is and what will be, which meant it occupied both temporalities with equal certainty, which was also a structural impossibility. Before that, the two heads had argued about everything with the specific productive tension of two positions that illuminated each other. Now one head was arguing with itself. The other head had gone quiet. Not closed, open, speaking, but the words were the same words the other head was saying. Not agreement. Something worse than disagreement. The erasure of the distinction. The what will be head was speaking what is, which meant the future had collapsed onto the present, which meant something had made the future stop being meaningfully different from the present. Something had settled. Something had made its presence so total that the future looked exactly like the present looked. A galaxy with these three entities in it, fully emerged, operating openly. Tzeentch noticed. In the crystal labyrinth, the architect of fate perceived through Fate Weaver's collapse that the future he had been navigating toward, the future in which his schemes accumulated and compounded and produced the infinite ramifying possibilities that Tzeentch fed on, was no longer the only future. Something had inserted a set of certainties. Fixed points, which Tzeentch found offensive on a philosophical level because fixed points represented the foreclosure of the possibility space that was his food. He looked at the fixed points. He looked at where they had come from. He had not known about the prime evils. He was the architect of fate. He had not known. He turned every scheming process in his vast distributed cognition toward the question of how something could have been in the warp for 10,000 years without appearing in any of his projections, and arrived, within moments, at an answer that he found genuinely astonishing. They had been hiding inside his schemes. Every plan Tzeentch had made for 10,000 years had involved the manipulation of fear energy, and hatred energy, and destruction energy, the emotional substrates that he drew on for his works. The prime evils had been inside those substrates, operating at a level below the threshold of his observation, using his own plans as cover. Every time he had manipulated the flow of those energies for his own purposes, he had been inadvertently providing camouflage for three entities building power underneath him. He had been their blind spot because he was too grand to see below himself. The revelation was, in a Tzeentchian sense, beautiful. He would have appreciated it more if it were not currently catastrophic. Khorne's response was direct. Khorne's responses were always direct. The Blood God did not scheme, and did not wait, and did not perceive nuance in problems. He identified threats, and he destroyed them. He had destroyed threats this way for 10,000 years, and the method had never failed, because the method was the truest expression of what Khorne was. He sent Rakareth. The name was not meaningful to anyone outside Khorne's domain, but the entity itself was the greatest bloodthirster currently manifest in the warp, the finest instrument of destruction that the Blood God possessed, a being that had destroyed Primarchs and cracked worlds, and whose passage through the upper warp left trails of shattered psychic material that lesser daemons fed on for centuries. Rakareth took Khorne's mandate and descended into the deep warp. It was not subtle about the descent. Subtlety was not in Rakareth's operational vocabulary. It found the deep warp's calm spaces wrong from the first moment. Too still, too old. The quiet down here was not the absence of chaos. It was the presence of something that had decided chaos was not worth generating. Rakareth advanced regardless. It was the Blood God's finest instrument. It found Diablo, not Baal. Diablo, the youngest prime evil, the Lord of Terror, who was also the most precise, the one who had been studying the Chaos God's natures for 10,000 years, while accumulating the specific knowledge required to be maximally effective when the encounter came. Diablo did not fight Rakareth. He looked at it. That was all. But the looking was everything, because Diablo's looking was not the passive reception of visual information. His looking was the specific act of a being who found things and opened them, who perceived the interior of what he observed rather than its surface, who read 10,000 years of existence in the specific way that Rakareth held itself and its weapon, and found inside that history the precise shape of what the bloodthirster was most afraid of. Rakareth was afraid of one thing. Every being that existed was afraid of one thing, even if the being was constitutionally incapable of acknowledging the fear. For Rakareth, the fear was the specific terror of irrelevance, the fear of a being whose entire existence was defined by its function, discovering that the function was inadequate, that it was not, ultimately, Khorne's finest instrument, that in 10,000 years of destroying things, it had failed to destroy the thing that mattered, that it was powerful and insufficient. Diablo opened that door. Not violently, the way you opened a door that had been closed for a long time, the pressure of the opening itself, demonstrating that it had always been possible to open. Rakareth felt the inside of its own deepest fear. 3 seconds. The greatest bloodthirster in Khorne's service stood in the deep warp for 3 seconds and experienced the complete certainty that it was not enough, had never been enough, and Khorne knew it and had sent it anyway because Khorne considered it expendable. 3 seconds. Diablo closed the door. Rockareth was still standing, still functional, still armed. The 3 seconds had not destroyed it or weakened it in any physical sense, but something had changed in how it was standing. "Return to your master," Diablo said. His voice was not loud. It occupied exactly the space that voices occupied, and no more. "Tell him that destroying me would require understanding me, and understanding requires asking what you are afraid of. And I know Khorne well enough to know that asking that question is the one thing he cannot do." Rockareth returned. It did not retreat. It returned. It had been given a message to carry, and it carried it. But when Khorne received his finest instrument back and felt through the psychic bond what Rockareth had experienced in those 3 seconds, the specific interior of the fear that Diablo had opened, Khorne felt something that the blood god had not felt since before the heresy. Rage without an adequate target. The worst kind. The kind that fed on itself. In his domain in the warp, Khorne bled power upward into the galaxy, and could not stop it, and could not direct it, and knew that somewhere in the deep places beneath his notice, something was absorbing exactly that outpouring, and finding it useful. The blood god was feeding his enemy. He had been feeding his enemy for 10,000 years, and he could not stop, because stopping meant stopping being Khorne. Diablo, in the deep warp, noted the outpouring and felt something that, if he had been a being given to expression, might have appeared on his face as satisfaction. He had known this would happen. He had designed this to happen. The plan was proceeding.
Okay, lore nerd moment. Can we just appreciate how insane this situation actually is? Because the Chaos Gods have spent 10,000 years acting like they own the warp, and meanwhile these three have basically been sitting in the basement the entire time collecting rent. I'm serious. Khorne is furious. Tzeentch is confused. And somehow that's not even the scary part. The scary part is that nobody has attacked yet. Think about that. If this is what they're doing before the war starts, what exactly have they been preparing for? Because Guilliman is about to ask the same question. And trust me, the answer is way worse than it sounds.
Guilliman read Covenant's briefing in 40 minutes. Not because 40 minutes was all the time he had. He had cleared his schedule when the Priority Alpha came through. Because Priority Alpha from an Ordo Malleus Inquisitor with Grey Knight's corroboration was the specific combination of flags that his 40 years of living with the Inquisition's taxonomy had taught him meant something genuinely outside the established order. He read in 40 minutes because the briefing, despite its scale and its implications, was clearly and efficiently written, and Covenant had not padded it with qualifications or procedural framing. She had written what she knew. What she knew was devastating. He set the briefing down. He looked at the wall of his command chamber aboard the Macragg's Honor, which was hung with charts and disposition maps, and the accumulated logistical picture of a crusade trying to stabilize a galaxy torn in half. He had been staring at these charts for years. He knew their contents the way he knew his own face. He was no longer looking at the charts. He was looking through them at the implication of what he had just read. 3 entities, deep warp, 10,000 years of concealment, 900 years of suppressed evidence, a reservoir of power built from the emotional runoff of chaos activity, distilled into something purer and more concentrated than the chaos gods themselves produced. Nemesis weapons that worked, but didn't work right. 14 empty records, and an unknown senior inquisitor who had been erasing evidence for 9 centuries. He went back to the briefing. He read one section again. The entities showed both Inquisitor Sable and Grand Master Vane specific information. In each case, the information was shown deliberately. In each case, the information conveyed the same thing, the scope of what has been done, and the implication that the scope is complete. He set it down again. He activated his Vox. "Get me Vayne and Covenant on a shared channel," he said. "And find out who in the Inquisition's senior tiers has had archive access at the level required to delete 23 Grey Knight case files without a signatory record. I want names." He stood. He walked to the viewport. The Great Rift was visible at this range as a luminous wrongness in the starfield. Not dramatic from here, not the screaming tear in reality that it appeared at close range, but unmistakably wrong in the way that wounds were unmistakably wounds even when they had partially closed. He had looked at the Great Rift from this viewport many times in the years since his return, and had never fully accommodated himself to it. Every time he looked at it, he felt the same thing, the specific grief of someone who had designed something carefully and returned to find it broken in a way that the design should have prevented. He looked at the rift. He thought about the briefing. He thought about one sentence in particular, which Covenant had placed near the end without emphasis, which was where she put the things she was not yet certain about, but which she considered necessary to include. The temporal distribution of the 14 empty records and the warp activity pattern anomalies suggest the entity's activity has been continuous, not periodic. They have been operating at some level of engagement for the full 10,000 years, not dormant with periods of activity, continuous, for 10,000 years. He thought about what 10,000 years of continuous operation, hidden in the deep warp, implied about planning. Not the scale of the plan, the maturity of it. A plan that had been running continuously for 10,000 years was not a plan in the sense that military campaigns were plans. It was more like infrastructure, something built so thoroughly into the fabric of ongoing reality that it became indistinguishable from the fabric itself. He thought about infrastructure. He thought about what you built infrastructure for. The channel opened. Vayne's voice came first. "Regent, then Covenant. Regent. I'm transmitting the latest findings as we speak." He turned from the viewport. "Before you do," he said, "I want to ask each of you the same question, and I want your honest assessment, not your institutional position." He sat at his command table. "In your experience, Vayne, 40 years of Grey Knights. Covenant, 20 years of Ordo Malleus. Have you ever encountered a threat that announced itself deliberately, that wanted to be found? Not as a provocation, not as a feint, as a genuine communication." Silence on the channel. Vayne spoke first. "Once, a chaos sorcerer who had gone too far into Tzeentchian corruption wanted to be stopped. He arranged to be found because he couldn't stop himself and knew it. He wanted intervention," Guilliman said. "Yes." "This is different," Guilliman said. "These entities are not asking to be stopped. They showed you specific information. They showed Sable a map. They let you see them, and then watched you leave. That is not a being asking for intervention." He looked at the briefing on his table. What does deliberate self-revelation serve when you are not asking to be stopped? Covenant's voice. It serves the revelation itself. Explain. "Fear is more powerful when the threat is known," Covenant said. "If we discovered them accidentally, through investigation, we would understand them as a discovered threat. We would categorize them as something we found. But they revealed themselves. They chose the moment and the method. That means we understand them as a threat that chose to be known, which is categorically more frightening, because it implies they are not afraid of being known." Guilliman looked at the briefing. "They are not afraid of being known," he said, "because being known is part of the function." The channel was quiet. "Diablo," he said, "the Lord of Terror. His power is not generating fear. It is taking the fear that already exists and opening the door to it." He looked at the rift through the viewport. A galaxy that knows something ancient and patient has been in the dark beneath everything it trusted for 10,000 years and has chosen this moment to reveal itself. That galaxy is experiencing a very specific kind of fear. He let the sentence sit. "The revelation is the first weapon," he said. "We are currently inside it." The findings Covenant transmitted arrived in 3 parts. The first part was the completed warp activity pattern analysis, the full picture, not the preliminary assessment she had shared with Vayne. 10,000 years of background warp composition data across 6 segmenta, not just the Tempestus. The scope had been expanded when the analysis team realized the Tempestus anomalies did not exist in isolation. The pattern was galaxy-wide. 8 distinct reservoir zones in the segmentum Tempestus were matched by 11 in the Obscurus, 9 in the Solar, 7 in the Pacificus, and a cluster of 23 in the Ultima segmentum that appeared to be the largest single concentration. The total accumulation, calculated across all zones, was a number that Covenant's analyst had checked 4 times before including it because it exceeded the models they had for Chaos God power reserves. It exceeded them substantially. Guilliman read the number. He did not say anything for a moment. "These are power reserves," he said. "Yes," Covenant said. "Built over 10,000 years. Not maintained, actively built. Each year's accumulation slightly larger than the previous years because the Chaos God's output has been increasing as their power grows, which means the fraction being redirected has also increased. Compounding interest," Vane said. "At a 10,000-year term," Covenant said. Guilliman looked at the number again. He had a facility for very large numbers. Primarchs were built for strategic cognition at scales that human minds struggled with. Even his facility found this number uncomfortable. "The second part," he said. "The second part was Inquisitor Sable's full deposition, taken under oath and seal, describing his encounter with the entities in detail. Covenant had interviewed him personally after the initial channel contact, and the deposition ran to 40 pages of precise, unadorned testimony. Guilliman read it in 11 minutes. The relevant section was near the end, where Sable described the map he had been shown, the 10,000-year span of Imperial history, with specific points illuminated. He had spent 14 months cataloging the illuminated points from memory, cross-referencing them against the historical record, trying to identify what they had in common. He had identified the common thread. Every illuminated point was an instance of institutional failure caused by the inversion of a bond. Not military defeat, not natural disaster, not external attack, internal failure. In every case, generated by a specific dynamic, a relationship that had been loyalty became obsession, or devotion became fanaticism, or trust became betrayal. 847 instances across 10,000 years of documented Imperial history. Sable's final line in the deposition: "I cannot determine whether these failures were observed by the entities or caused by them. The map they showed me did not specify. I believe this ambiguity is deliberate." Guilliman read that line twice. "Mephisto," he said. "The Lord of Hatred. The eldest prime evil. The one who corrupted through bonds." He looked at 847 instances of institutional failure caused by the inversion of bonds. "Covenant," he said, "your professional assessment. Looking at those 847 cases, what fraction do you believe were directly caused rather than observed?" A pause. "My assessment," Covenant said carefully, "is that the question is not the right question. The distinction between causing and observing matters less than the pattern. Whether Mephisto caused each failure or simply identified and accelerated an existing tendency, the result is identical. 847 moments where the Imperium's internal architecture was stressed at a specific joint." She stopped. "He knows which joints are load-bearing." Guilliman looked at the wall of charts. At the disposition maps of the Indomitus Crusade, at the institutional architecture of a civilization he had returned to find creaking under a weight it had been accumulating for 10,000 years. "The third part," he said. "The third part was shorter than the others." It was a cross-reference analysis that Covenant's team had run in the last hour before transmission. The 847 institutional failure events mapped against the sequence of events that had produced the Great Rift. 15 of the 847 appeared in the sequence. Not peripheral appearances, load-bearing ones. Decisions that had been made by institutions whose bonds had previously been identified as inverted, feeding into other decisions, cascading across centuries into the specific final sequence that had broken Cadia and opened the sky. Covenant had written 3 words below the cross-reference result and underlined them. He arranged it. Guilliman read the 3 words. He closed the briefing. He sat at his command table in silence for 90 seconds, which was the longest he had been silent in a long time. Then he stood and walked to the viewport and looked at the Great Rift, at the wound in reality that had torn the galaxy in half, that had cost Cadia and the pylons, and the deaths of billions, and the isolation of half the Imperium. And he looked at it with the specific expression of a man who had just understood something he had been misunderstanding for years. He had believed the rift was the consequence of chaos. It was, and something had been using chaos to build it for 10,000 years. He called the briefing with his senior staff 2 hours later. 12 people in the room. Lord Commander Robute Guilliman, his senior military advisors, his political council, the Lord of the Dark Angels present by hololithic connection, inquisitorial representatives in 2 of the seats. Vane had joined the channel. Covenant was present in person, having moved to the Macragg's honor at his request. He briefed them. He did not soften it. When he finished, the room had the specific quality of silence that followed information too large to immediately process. Not the silence of shock, the silence of people running the implications forward in their minds and finding the implications running off the edge of what their models contained. His political council spoke first. The evidence that Mephisto caused the rift is circumstantial, she said. 15 events in a sequence of hundreds. The causal chain would need to be proven beyond reasonable doubt to justify what action, Guilliman said. She stopped. This is not a prosecution, he said. We are not assembling evidence for a tribunal. We are assessing a threat. He looked at the table. The question of whether Mephisto caused the rift is less important than the question of whether he is capable of it, and the evidence strongly supports capability. An entity that has been operating continuously in the warp for 10,000 years, that has been systematically studying and inverting the bonds within imperial institutions for 847 documented instances, that has accumulated power resources exceeding our models for Chaos God reserves. He looked at his council. That entity is capable of arranging the rift. Whether it did is a matter for historians. What it might arrange next is a matter for us. His senior military advisor, what does it want? Guilliman looked at him. That is the right question, he said. And I don't have the answer. What I have is the observation that everything they have done in 10,000 years has been preparation, not execution, preparation. The reservoir building, the institutional mapping, the deliberate concealment, the patience. All of it has the quality of a preliminary phase. He looked at the Great Rift through the chamber's viewport. The rift opening is what ended the preliminary phase. They have announced themselves in the days since the rift opened. The Bloodthirster retreated. Fate Weaver fell silent. The Iron Warriors encountered Baal. A Grey Knight Grandmaster was shown the interior of his own deepest fear. These are not attacks. They are demonstrations. He looked at the room. They are demonstrating capability before they explain what they want it for, he said. Which means what they want it for is either something they believe we will refuse to grant, or something they believe refusing to grant will make easier to take. Covenant spoke from her seat. Or they are demonstrating capability to an audience that is not us. Guilliman looked at her. The Chaos Gods, she said. The entities have been concealed from the Chaos Gods for 10,000 years. Their emergence is simultaneous with their announcement to the Imperium. They are not choosing between audiences. They are announcing to both simultaneously. She looked at the table. The Chaos Gods now know the prime evils exist. Khorne's Bloodthirster encountered Diablo and returned. Tzeentch's oracle went silent. These are the Chaos Gods being shown the same demonstration we are being shown. Vane's voice from the channel. They're announcing themselves to everyone at once. Which means, Covenant said, they are not concerned about either side's response. They have calculated that neither the Imperium nor the Chaos Gods can stop what comes next. The announcement is not a warning. She looked at Guilliman. It is a courtesy. The room absorbed this. Guilliman looked at the Great Rift, at a wound in reality that had been arranged, possibly over 10,000 years, by an entity whose power now exceeded the models for gods. He had a question. He did not ask it in the briefing, because the briefing was not the place for it. The briefing was for facts and assessments and operational responses. The question was not operational. He asked it later, alone, standing at the viewport. He asked it to the rift, which did not answer, because the rift was a wound, and wounds did not answer questions. The question was, if you have been here for 10,000 years, and you have had the capability to act for at least 900 years, and you arranged the rift, why did you wait for the rift to announce yourself? What does the rift being open give you that it being closed did not? He looked at the rift. He thought about the reservoir. He thought about 10,000 years of compounding power, distilled from chaos activity, refined into something purer than the chaos gods produced. He thought about what a reservoir was for. He looked at the rift, at the tear in reality that connected the warp to real space in ways that the galaxy had never experienced before, that allowed chaos to pour into real space at unprecedented rates, that had been doing exactly that since Cadia fell. More warp contact meant more chaos. Activity meant more emotional energy generated, meant more output for the prime evil's reservoir to redirect. The rift was not just a product of their planning. The rift was part of their current intake system. He looked at the viewport. You opened a tap, he said quietly, to the rift, to the dark, to the specific patient intelligence he now believed had been arranging this for 10,000 years. The rift pulsed with the light of accumulated suffering. He turned from the viewport. He had two problems simultaneously, and they had the specific interlocking quality of problems that had been designed to be handled simultaneously, so that handling one made the other worse. The Chaos Gods, enraged by the prime evil's emergence, would increase their aggression in the warp and in real space. Defending against that increased aggression would cost the Imperium resources and attention. The prime evils, operating in the space that the increased chaos aggression created, would be advancing whatever the second phase of a 10,000-year plan looked like. Defending against chaos made you more vulnerable to the prime evils. Addressing the prime evils required resources currently defending against chaos. He looked at his briefing room, at the charts that had defined his work since he woke from 10,000 years of absence. He had been fighting one war. He had been fighting one war while standing on the infrastructure of another. He activated his Vox. Get me the Grey Knight's full operational roster, he said. Every strike cruiser, every brotherhood, every current deployment. He paused. And get me the Ordo Malleus's complete archive on the suppressed cases. Not the deleted content, the suppression record. I want to know who erased those files. He looked at the charts. We have been categorizing this incorrectly, he said. Not to anyone in the room. To the problem itself, the way he had always talked to problems when they were large enough to deserve address. Everything we have seen in 10,000 years that we called chaos corruption, we need to look at it again. Some of it was chaos. Some of it was something else wearing the same clothes. He looked at 847 case files and the 15 that touched the rift. Find me the ones we got wrong. In the deep warp, Mephisto observed the Regent's conclusion with the satisfaction of something that had been waiting for a specific response and had received it precisely. Not gloating. Mephisto did not gloat. Gloating was an expression of triumph, and triumph was premature when the work was ongoing. He felt, instead, the specific professional satisfaction of a craftsman watching the piece settle into the form it had been built for. Guilliman was looking in the right direction. He had told him where to look. Through Sable, through the map, through the 847 cases, and the 15 that touched the rift. He had told Guilliman exactly enough to make him look at the institutional architecture of the Imperium and find the joints. The joints that Mephisto knew from 10,000 years of study. The joints that were still under stress. Guilliman, looking for what Mephisto had done, would find evidence of what Mephisto had done. He would go to those institutions. He would investigate those bonds. He would bring the Imperium's attention. Inquisitorial authority, Grey Knight scrutiny, primarchal oversight, to bear on every joint that Mephisto had identified as compromised. And in doing so, he would do exactly what Mephisto needed him to do. Because the joints that Mephisto had not touched were the ones that were still held by genuine bonds. And Guilliman's investigation, thorough and righteous, would probe and pressure every joint in the system, including those. In the dark of the deep warp, the Lord of Hatred found the specific emotion that his nature had refined across 60 million years of existence. Not pleasure, not triumph, not the crude satisfaction of a scheme succeeding. The cold, clean precision of something understood completely. Guilliman was brilliant. He had been given the tool to examine every vulnerable joint in his own civilization. He was going to use it. 3 things happened in the same hour. The first was in the Segmentum Obscurus, on a void station called Mercy's Anchorage, that served as a resupply point for Grey Knight strike cruisers operating in that theater. The station's librarian, a Grey Knight named Aldos who had served 42 years, and who the Brotherhood considered one of their finest psychic analysts, was reviewing Vane's transmission about the deep warp encounter when something arrived in the station's psychic space. Not a demonic incursion, not a warp breach, something softer than either and therefore harder to respond to. A specific memory that did not belong to him, delivered into his consciousness, the way a letter was delivered through a slot, without violence, without negotiation. The memory was not his. He knew it was not his because his memories had a particular quality. The Grey Knight training produced very specific psychic signatures in one's internal experience, and this memory had none of those signatures. This memory belonged to someone else. Someone who had held it for a long time before choosing to place it here. The memory was of a conversation. A Grey Knight Grand Master, not Vane, someone older, the face unfamiliar to Aldos but the armor-bearing insignia he placed in M38, speaking to something in the deep warp. The conversation was clear and ordered, which meant it had been preserved with intention. Someone had preserved this memory for delivery. The Grand Master in the memory was asking questions. The answers came from something Aldos could not see clearly in the memory's frame, only here. A voice that sat at a frequency below emotional range, patient and precise. The Grand Master, what do you want? The answer, to be understood before we are needed. The Grand Master, needed for what? A silence in the memory. Not the silence of not answering. The silence of something deciding how much truth served its purpose at this moment. Then, the Chaos Gods are a symptom. We are the diagnosis. The memory ended. Aldo sat in his librarium and looked at his hands and felt the specific texture of a communication designed to arrive at this moment, held in reserve somewhere in the warp's deep architecture until the conditions were right to release it, until a Grey Knight was sitting with Vane's report open in front of him, and the question of what the entities wanted was the one question the report didn't answer. He transmitted everything to Vane immediately. Then he sat with the final line. The Chaos Gods are a symptom. We are the diagnosis. He did not know what it meant. He knew it was true. That combination, not knowing what something meant while knowing it was true, was the specific state that 42 years of Grey Knight training had not fully prepared him for, and he sat in it for a long time before he was able to stand up and return to work. The second thing happened in the Eye of Terror. Inside the Eye, where the warp and real space had merged into something that was neither and both, a daemon prince named Serathis held court. Serathis had ascended 3,000 years ago through devoted service to Tzeentch. He was not the most powerful daemon prince in the Eye, but he was among the most thoughtful, Tzeentch's gifts tended toward perception and strategic complexity rather than raw strength, and Sarathis had developed across 3 millennia into something that had genuine insight into the warp's architecture. He had been feeling something for 2 centuries. Not a presence exactly, an absence. The specific absence of something that should have been arriving in his patron's domain and wasn't. Every act of schemed betrayal that Sarathis conducted in Tzeentch's name produced a specific quantity of psychic energy that traveled upward through the warp toward Tzeentch. For 3,000 years, that transit had been reliable. He performed the act, the energy moved, the patron received. 2 centuries ago, the energy arriving at Tzeentch had started feeling thinner. Not the energy he generated. He had checked his workings. His methods were unchanged. The energy leaving him was the same as always. But something in the transit was taking a cut, a very small cut. Small enough that for a century he had dismissed it as measurement error, warp noise, the statistical imprecision of psychic accounting. In the 2nd century, he had stopped dismissing it. He had traced it. He had spent a century tracing it, using every Tzeentchian investigative method at his disposal, following the thread of his own energy through its path toward Tzeentch, and looking for where the discrepancy entered the accounting. He had found the level where it happened. He had found the deep warp. He had gone in. He had come back. He had not told Tzeentch what he found. He had been deciding, for 2 weeks in real space-time, whether to tell Tzeentch what he found, and the decision was complicated by the specific nature of what he had found, and what Tzeentch's response to finding that his psychic income had been quietly taxed for 3,000 years would be, a response Sarathis did not want to be adjacent to. Then Diablo had shown him something. Not in the deep warp. After he returned, Diablo had reached into the Eye of Terror's upper warp, where Sarathis made his court, and had delivered a single image with the same precision and the same absence of drama as everything the prime evils apparently did. The image was of Sarathis, 3,000 years ago, at the moment of his ascension, at the moment when Tzeentch had touched him and changed him from mortal champion to daemon prince. At the specific moment of that transformation, seen clearly and completely, Tzeentch's hand in it, and beneath Tzeentch's hand, something else. Something that had been present at the transformation and had taken something from it. Not from Tzeentch, from Sarathis. From the specific quality of what Sarathis was before the transformation. The mortal quality that ascension would remove. The capacity for genuine surprise, for encountering the truly unknown. Tzeentch had taken that in the ascension and used it to bind Sarathis to his service. Something had been present and had noted what was taken, and had been holding the information for 3,000 years. Sarathis looked at the image. He looked at it for a long time. Then he did the thing that 3,000 years of Tzeentchian service had trained him for. He made a calculation. On one side of the calculation, Tzeentch, who had taken something from him at the moment of greatest vulnerability and used it as a chain, who had been receiving a taxed version of Sarathis's psychic output for potentially his entire service without his knowledge. On the other side, something in the deep warp that had been watching for 3,000 years, that had preserved his pre-ascension moment with apparent care, and that had chosen to show him this, now. The calculation was not difficult. He opened a channel into the deep warp. "I want to speak to the one called Mephisto," he said. The response came immediately, which meant it had been expected. "I have been waiting for you to call," said a voice from below everything. "You are the 4th daemon prince this week." Sarathis sat with that information. 4 daemon princes, independently, reaching the same conclusion. He thought about what 4 daemon princes independently reconsidering their allegiance meant for the structural integrity of the Chaos Power's servant hierarchy. He thought about Mephisto's specific gift, the inversion of bonds, the transformation of loyalty into its opposite. He thought about the fact that Mephisto had not reached out to the 4 of them. They had reached out to him. He thought about the difference. "What do you want from us?" Sarathis said. "Nothing yet," said Mephisto. "I want you to understand what you are. When you understand that, you will know what you want, and then we will have a real conversation." The channel closed. Cerathus sat in his court in the Eye of Terror and was, for the first time in 3,000 years, genuinely uncertain about what happened next. In his experience, genuine uncertainty was the beginning of genuine freedom. The third thing happened to Covenant. She was reviewing the suppression records, working through the archive metadata of the 14 empty files, looking for the deletion signature that would tell her who had erased them, when she found the 15th. Not a deleted file. A file she had not found in the original search because it had not been in the records she searched. It was in a different archive tier, one that required an access level she had but rarely used, filed under a category so obscure that a standard keyword search would never surface it. The file was from M36, 1,500 years older than the oldest deleted record. It was not a Grey Knight case file. It was a personal journal entry from an Inquisitor Lord, a senior tier she had not been searching in, which was why it survived while the operational records were deleted. The personal journals of deceased Inquisitor Lords were archived but not actively indexed. They existed in the system and could be found if you knew where to look, but nothing in the standard search protocols would surface them. The entry was dated late M36 and ran to 12 pages. Covenant, read it in full. The Inquisitor Lord, whose name was Erasmus Vale, had been Ordo Malleus for 53 years at the time of writing. He was not describing an encounter with the entities. He was describing the aftermath of one, the specific state of an old man who had understood something and was writing it down because writing it down was the only way to make it real enough to act on. He had met something in the deep warp 30 years before the journal entry. He had encountered it the way Vane had encountered it, the way Sable had encountered it. Not attacked, shown. In his case, the entity had shown him something different. Not a map of failures, not his own fear. A warning. Specifically, the entities had shown him that the Inquisition had been suppressing evidence of their existence for 200 years before his encounter. That someone inside the institution had been erasing records and managing access and ensuring that the investigation never accumulated enough for a complete picture to form. He had spent 30 years trying to find who. He had found them. Covenant read the name. She read it twice. She cross-referenced it. The name belonged to an Inquisitor Lord who had been dead for 800 years, which meant the corruption of the suppression program predated Vale by centuries and post-dated him by centuries, which meant it was not an individual. It was a position. The same institutional role, held by different individuals over 1,500 years, each one perpetuating the suppression that the previous one had maintained. Not a conspiracy in the conventional sense, a tradition of suppression passed from Inquisitor Lord to Inquisitor Lord across 1,500 years, each recipient briefed by their predecessor, each one making the same choice to continue what had been started. She looked at the current occupant of the institutional role Vale had identified. She checked the registry. The current occupant was alive. She looked at his case for 30 seconds. She looked at Vale's journal. She looked at the 15 cases together, 14 deleted. One survived because it was in the wrong archive tier, and no one had thought to find it. She activated her Vox. Guilliman, she said, I need to send you something. Read it before you speak to anyone else. She looked at the current occupant's registry entry. Anyone. She transmitted Vial's journal. She waited. Guilliman read it in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. 12 pages. A dead Inquisitor Lord's account of 1,500 years of institutional suppression of evidence about the prime evil's existence. He set it down. He thought about Mephisto, about the inversion of bonds, about loyalty becoming obsession, devotion becoming fanaticism, trust becoming the specific instrument of its own betrayal. He thought about a tradition of suppression passed from Inquisitor Lord to Inquisitor Lord across 1,500 years, each one briefed by their predecessor, each one continuing the work. He thought about the specific bond between an Inquisitor Lord and their institutional role, the devotion to the Imperium's protection that was the foundation of every Inquisitor's identity. He thought about how that bond, inverted, would look. Not abandonment of the Imperium's protection. Something more precise. The conviction, genuine and deeply held, that protecting the Imperium meant controlling what the Imperium knew. That knowledge of the prime evil's existence would cause more damage than ignorance of it. That the suppression was itself the protection. The conviction would feel like duty. It would look like duty. It would be the inversion of duty. The specific moment when protecting people became deciding what people were allowed to know, which was not protection, but control, wearing protection's face. He thought about whether the original Inquisitor Lord who started the tradition 1500 years ago had come to that conviction independently. He thought about Mephisto for a long time. Covenant, he said on the channel. The current occupant of the role. Do not approach him. Do not alert him. I need him alive, and I need him unaware that we have found this. He looked at his command table. Mephisto has been using him, probably using the whole tradition. The conviction that drives the suppression, the belief that knowledge of the prime evils is more dangerous than ignorance, is exactly the kind of inverted bond that Mephisto produces. He looked at the viewport. If we arrest him, we lose the thread. I want to follow the thread back to where Mephisto first touched this. Covenant's voice. That means letting the suppression continue while we investigate. For a defined period, he said. Closely watched, with the specific goal of understanding how Mephisto communicates with his assets. He looked at the table. If he has had a tradition of suppression running inside the Inquisition for 1500 years, he has a mechanism for maintaining it. I want that mechanism. A beat. Understood, Covenant said. He looked at Vale's journal on his table. Had an Inquisitor Lord who had figured this out 1500 years ago and had written it in his personal journal rather than filing an official report, because Vale had understood that the official channels were compromised, and the official response to an official report would be to erase it, and the only thing he could do that would survive was to write it somewhere small enough to be overlooked. He had been right. It had survived 800 years and had been found by someone who was ready to find it. Guilliman thought about that, about a dead man's specific choice to hide truth somewhere it could wait. He thought about the entities who had been hiding in the deep warp for 10,000 years, waiting for the moment when they would be found by someone ready to find them. He thought about Baal's line to the Iron Warrior's warsmith, which Krovar had transmitted in full. Destruction requires no reason at all. He thought about Diablo showing Rockareth its deepest fear, and then letting it return to Khorne. He thought about Mephisto and the 4 daemon princes who had called him. He thought about Serathis' transmission, which Covenant had included in her package. I want to speak to the one called Mephisto. And the answer? You are the 4th daemon prince this week. 4 daemon princes, independently, reaching out to the Lord of Hatred. He thought about what that meant for the structural integrity of the Chaos Powers hierarchy. He stood. He walked to the viewport. The Great Rift pulsed in the starfield, more active than it had been a month ago. More chaos pouring into real space. More emotional energy generated. More input for the prime evil's reservoir. They had opened a tap. The tap was running. And somewhere in the warp, beneath the Chaos God's awareness, the 3 oldest things in the galaxy were doing what they had been doing for 10,000 years, accumulating, refining, waiting with the patience of something that understood that time was not a pressure, but a resource. He looked at the rift. He had 2 things clearly now. What they were, what they had been doing. He did not have the 3rd thing. The thing that Vane's transmitted memory had asked and received a partial answer to. What do you want? To be understood before we are needed. Needed for what? He looked at the rift, at the chaos energy pouring through it. At the galaxy, he had spent years trying to stabilize against chaos, with tools that were proving less adequate every year, with institutions that were under stresses that 10,000 years of war had built, and that no amount of crusade logistics could fully address. Needed for what? He thought about the line from Aldos's delivered memory. The Chaos Gods are a symptom. We are the diagnosis. He had been treating symptoms. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had been treating symptoms. He looked at the Great Rift. He looked at the deep dark beyond it. He thought about an entity that was 10,000 years patient, that had accumulated power across the full history of the Imperium's war, that had been studying the Chaos God's nature from the inside, that had survived 10 millennia in the warp without being detected by beings who noticed everything, that had shown its hand only when it was ready, not before, not after, when it was ready. He thought about what something like that would consider itself ready for. He thought about the symptoms. He thought about the diagnosis. He was not certain. 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 But the shape of something was forming at the edge of his understanding, and the shape was the most unsettling thought he had formed in 10,000 years of existence, and he was not going to say it aloud until he was certain, because saying it aloud would change everything about what happened next. He looked at the viewport. Covenant, he said on the Vox. I need you to find me everything we know about what happens to the Chaos Gods when their power bases are disrupted. Not militarily, metaphysically. When the emotional substrate they feed on changes quality, or source, or composition. He looked at the rift. I have a hypothesis. I need data to test. What is the hypothesis? She said. Not yet, he said. Get me the data. The channel closed. He stood at the viewport alone with the rift and the dark and the gathering shape of an idea that 10,000 years of the Imperium had not had because the Imperium had been too busy fighting to develop it. Behind him, in the briefing room that was now covered in 847 case files and warp activity pattern charts and Vale's journal and the roster of 14 empty records and the transmission from an Iron Warrior's siege captain and the memory delivered to a librarian in segmentum obscurus, the accumulated evidence of 10,000 years of patient preparation sat in the amber light and waited to be understood. In the deep warp, three things that had been waiting for exactly this moment felt the shift in the investigation's direction and noted it with the satisfaction of something that had placed a piece on a board 10,000 years ago and was now watching it reach the position they had always intended it to occupy. Guilliman was brilliant. They had needed him to be. In the dark beneath everything the Imperium thought it knew, the prime evils had been waiting, and now they were done waiting.
The cosmos awakens. Power surges through us. Let the galaxies tremble.
Okay, I genuinely don't know. And that's exactly why I think this might be one of the most terrifying crossover stories we've ever told. For this entire journey, we kept asking one question: what do the prime evils actually want? And by the end, we still don't have the full answer. What we do know is somehow even worse. For 10,000 years, they never invaded. They never conquered. They simply waited. Beneath the warp. Beneath chaos. Beneath everything the galaxy thought it understood. And Guilliman is now standing one discovery away from a truth that could rewrite the entire history of Warhammer 40K. Technical hot take. The scariest thing in this story wasn't Diablo, it wasn't Mephisto, it wasn't Baal, it was Patience. Because anyone can win a war, but only a true cosmic horror can spend 10,000 years preparing for one. Now it's your turn. Why do you think the Prime Evils finally revealed themselves, and what do they actually need Guilliman for? Drop your best theory below. I read the comments every single video, and some of the craziest crossover ideas on this channel have come straight from this community. So if you love crossover stories that take impossible ideas and explore them like their real history, hit subscribe. because we're only getting started. Until next time. Stay curious, stay dangerous, and I'll see you in the next crossover.